Thank you and welcome to our panel, which is called Majority World Infrastructure, which I think is quite an awkward title, but I'm going to explain where we're coming from with this. During the previous panels, Aaron, Dial, and others have mentioned books like Surrogate Humanity, which are really wonderful pieces of research about things like the racialized labor of AI, the history of robots, coolies, and slaves, and so on. Panel is in some ways about the optimism that lies behind and after the triumph of U.S. empire and the extraction and exploitation of the majority by the minority. When the majority by the minority, I don't simply mean language or gender or class or nation. I think what many of the scholars, all of whom I admire and think are actually the next wave of infrastructure studies, what they are studying is often the forms of parallel, fugitive, and covert building and innovation, which tends to get glossed over quite a bit because often people are very focused on business development and IPOs and these kinds of things. So in the US, digital infrastructure is privately owned, extremely profitable, and class-based. This recreates U.S. empire forged by militaristic occupation, intervention, and expansion by concentrating fiber, wire, patents, data sets, standards, and ownership closely in U.S. corporations. Just to give one example, the logic of colonization can really be seen in the requirement of TikTok to sell itself to a U.S. owner. It's hard to imagine a more blatant example of empire. We would never expect that a company like LinkedIn or Pinterest would be required to sell itself to China, to operate in China. 1 in 5 women in the US today are women of color. And by 2060, the majority of women in the US will be women of color. I wanted to bring this panel together because collectively they are studying the understudied, the material infrastructures and internet provision of the parts of the internet that function like the iceberg. They're unseen, but much, much bigger than people can imagine, and are needed to support the parts that we do see. So some questions we are going to be addressing are how internet infrastructures reflect racial and identitarian politics, how the structure and history and technological affordances of internet access reflect imperial colonial power relations, how to recenter humanity and the needs of humans in the methods and sensibilities we employ when analyzing digital infrastructure and others. So we're going to go through and everybody will do like a 5-minute rundown on who they are and what they're interested in, and then I'll just start posing questions.
Hi, my name is Marisa Duarte. I'm a member of the Pascuayaqui tribe. I'm also Chicana. My dad is Mexican-American from Arizona and Sonora area, that family. And then my mother is Pascuayaqui. Yaqui people are a binational tribe. We have a reservation on the U.S. side in Arizona, and we also have an autonomous zone in Sonora, in Rio Yaqui, Sonora. So I speak Spanish and English. I think in Spanish and English. I am a Yaqui language learner. I can understand it when I'm being spoken to, but still a little bit shy, speaking it fluidly. I was very much raised in the Yaqui religion. And one of my number one enemies is Carlos Castañeda. So I don't know if that might, to the younger generations, that might not be a thing, but you can Google it. And if somebody tells you that they like to take psychedelics and maybe they're over the age of 45 or 50 or so, they probably might have learned that from this fake anthropologist at UCLA who imagined somebody from my tribe, Don Huan, who was this guru. So that's my enemy because I need to set the record straight. That was the first disinformation, was that bro. Yeah, but I'm an information scientist by training, so I appreciate all of you who are from iSchools. I went through that, came out the other side. And a lot of the work that I do is trying to make Indigenous people's ways of knowing conversant, and in the spaces where the builders, the designers, the programmers, they're just not trained in the humanities, much less Indigenous ways of knowing. So that's a lot of the work that I do. I'm in the School of Social Transformation now at Arizona State University. I wrote a book called Network Sovereignty, Building the Internet Across Indian Country. It came out in 2017. And I'm still mulling over some of the things I said then when I was a grad student who didn't realize that you have to sit with your words. Hey, you all, when you put it out there in your dissertation, guess what? It haunts you for 10 or 20 years. And so I'm still dealing with that. But I teach justice theory. I teach critical Indigenous methodologies. Most of my doctoral students are Indigenous or Black, and they're doing very radical community-based work. I teach digital activism, surveillance in society, and I'll start teaching American Indian justice and Indigenous political trials in the fall.
Hello. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Buen provecho if you're still eating. Enjoy your meal, hopefully. My name is Chaar Lopez. I'm an assistant professor at UT Austin. I'm also the principal investigator in the Border Tech Lab at UT Austin. Sure, I could use the slide. There we go. I've been working on projects related to computing in the US-Mexico borderlands for the last almost 10 years. Recently, 2 months ago, I published my first book, Cybernetic Border, which is about border enforcement in the US-Mexico border area since the mid-20th century and how information infrastructures became fundamental and have become dominant modes of control in the region, and how race is embedded into this system. But more recently, I've been developing a new project, which is on border circuits. And oftentimes when people think about artificial intelligence or innovation more broadly, often people think about different regions like Silicon Valley or Route 128, or they think about maker spaces, or they think about startups, they think about laboratories but they don't think about the laboratory in the field. And the way that I'm developing this project is about thinking about the laboratory in the field, and the maquila is the laboratory in the field. So artificial intelligence relies on semiconductors, really powerful GPUs, right? And we often think of NVIDIA, and we think of maybe Intel, Apple. Right now it's really into developing these materials. But they're assembled and outsourced in places, I wouldn't say in the global south, I would say in depletion zones that are designed to extract, but that they are not depleted. They're still very much alive, very dynamic. And the maquila system since 1965 has been fundamental for semiconductors. And that's a kind of hidden history in the history of computing, and I'm really interested in thinking about how is Mexican labor, either intellectual labor or physical labor, fundamental for the innovation of computing, both in terms of the government officials and the company officials operated these factories, as well as the maquila women or the workers in the assembly lines, and their labor in kind of developing new modes of living with, but also living against computing infrastructures and the toxic environments that they leave behind. So that's all I'll say for now.
When I got the invitation to join this panel in January, I didn't look up what it stood for. And over the last couple of days, I'm regretting that I didn't think too hard about participating in a conference that has optimism in the title in the midst of a genocide. And this is the site that I work on. So I don't have a lot of optimism within me right now. And I don't think I can make myself engage with that in any genuine way. So I'll leave that to the rest of the panel. I'm an assistant professor at UC Irvine in film and media studies. And my book project, my therapist has told me to stop using air quotes. But I can't make myself stop. It just feels so fake. My book project is tentatively titled Digital Palestine, Principles of Subaltern New Media. And this is a riff off of Lev Manovich's Principles of New Media. So the manuscript centers Palestine as an infrastructurally limited zone to reconsider the principles of new media. So rather than formulating new media in under-resourced areas as just addenda or qualifiers to how digital technology should work, I posit that digital objects in spaces where first and second generation networks span are not imperfect technologies, or they're not plagued with infrastructure that's unable to transmit media as it should. Instead, these technologies are characterized by rupture, interruption, and lag, and these characteristics are how tech works in most of the world. So it's really us that our technologies function differently than the way the rest of the worlds do. So the book asks, how do our foundational theories on new media tech transform when we privilege the periphery, the underconnected, and the infrastructurally limited? So my research broadly considers 3 roles of technology in Palestine. The first is that Palestinian labor is exploited for tech work, and this is super interesting to me. So this is a lot of software work is outsourced because hardware can't get through checkpoints. So it's very nice of them to be considerate about what they're outsourcing. The second is something that's been written a lot by Naomi Klein and Anthony Lowenstein. So Palestine serves as a laboratory for testing technologies of death and destruction. And then the third way that technology is imbricated in Palestine is that tech serves as a tool for countering fragmentation of Palestinian land at the hands of Israeli colonialism. So what do I mean by fragmentation? So Israeli violence resulting in expulsion of both Palestinian people and the annexation of Palestinian land have fragmented Palestine. So this image shows one instance of fragmentation, which is when the Oslo Accords codified the severance of the West Bank into 3 jurisdictions. The segmentation of Palestinian land across the West Bank and Gaza has resulted in limited infrastructural development for ICT. For example, Palestinians must get building permits to install cell towers, and in the West Bank, Palestinians cannot build these service towers near the apartheid wall. We can also think about the infrastructural and geographic severance in the context of the genocide. So soon after October 7th, the Israeli military targeted infrastructures of communication in order to isolate Gazans from the outside world. So this is a screenshot from a notice on Paltel's Facebook page soon after the bombing of their hub. So Palestinians, of course, have been using eSIMs and microblogging services to counter Israel's efforts to isolate Palestinians. And I think that brings up a lot of questions about the value of witnessing and how we have this idea that if we know something is happening, that we can stop it. And I wonder if, for us, there's a difference witnessing the genocide or not. Obviously, for people who are in Gaza, I think that there is a difference, right? But I'm not sure if any of us have more agency just because we can see the death and destruction. So this is the context of fragmentation that Palestinians face. It's geographic, infrastructural, and sociopolitical. So within this context, many Palestinians turn to technology as a tool to combat this segmentation. So the project I'm thinking about currently dates back to 2016 and is located in the West Bank. Palestinian youth, through an organization called Baladna, separated into groups based on the villages that their families came from that were ethnically cleansed in 1948. So each group proposed a project that would practically approach the right of return, which is guaranteed through the United Nations Resolution 194. So one group from a Christian town called Ikrit occupied a destroyed church despite being evicted several times by the military. And this screenshot is from a group of descendants from the village of Al-Khabsiyah, and they produced a video that includes oral history from elders born before 1948 who actually lived in the town. Based on testimony and old maps, the group put together a 3D rendering of the village. They proposed an architectural plan that would blend elements of the destroyed village with modern amenities that would allow for Palestinian life to heal and thrive after return. So I'm interested in several types of severance that are being circumvented or worked against in this project. And I borrowed the language of severance from one of my colleagues at UC Irvine, Liran Moore, who proposes in her recent book titled Conflicts, the Politics and Poetics of Israel-Palestine, that the Arabic term for severance, or inqita, is a more accurate framework for understanding Palestine and Israel than through the framework of conflict. So this project works, this 3D project, works against the severance of Palestinians from historical memory. It works against generational severance or divide. And this rendering also works against Israel's best efforts to sever Palestinians from a life and a future. So, thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. First, I just want to say thank you to my fellow panelists. It's really exciting to be in conversation and to get to know you these last few days for those of you who I'm just meeting through the Disco Summit. And I've been feeling very energized by the Black innovation, Black AI conversation, because I feel some of the conversation and the questions, that Zoom question about African English as perhaps this kind of invisible norm really gets at these questions of infrastructure that our panel is centered on. And that question stuck with me because a lot of my own research thinks about this relationship between infrastructure and representation and how it might be visible or expressed, for example, in ChatGPT as a form of a particular form of English. So my name is Huan. I am a faculty member in an English department at Vanderbilt University. My training is in Asian American studies, so I come from ethnic studies and American studies. And to share a little bit about my research, a core question that animates all of my research projects is what's Asian or Asian American about the digital? And it's a really capacious, messy question that I've tried to embrace in my thinking. So I'm currently working on a book on representations of digital capitalism in Asian American literature and art. And it's a project that turns to art and literature to explore how Asians and Asian Americans have been both willing and unwilling builders of technological worlds, from the pre-digital histories of the railroad to the informatic design of Japanese internment camps as model democratic worlds, to Silicon Valley globalization, to the occupational concentration of Asian Americans in STEM fields, post-1965's Immigration Act. And more recently, I've been thinking about the Asians being at the forefront of new speculative forms of digital capitalism, such as Web3. I've been really obsessed and curious about this really strange world of blockchain and crypto that comes in and out of the conversation. Across my research, I'm interested in racialized and gendered Asian labor, but also thinking about the flows of Asian capital as well. That's been the lifeblood of sustaining many of these extractive digital networks. And I want to say, so I've been thinking about, for example, the fact that there's a vast amount of East and Southeast Asians in research sectors in Silicon Valley, and thinking about this conversation with AI, NVIDIA and Jensen Huang, and the kind of connections with Taiwan and TSC. How is Asianness functioning on these global scales, and how it might be actually a mode of smoothing, thinking about our conversations about friction, smoothing the operations of digital capitalism and its kind of transfer on a global scale. That's a little bit of my research overall, but I wanted to maybe just share a little bit about one of the essays that I wrote during my time here as a Disco postdoc for the Just Tech essay series that many of us postdocs contributed to. So I wrote about crypto gaming, which is a really interesting kind of phenomenon in terms of thinking about the Philippines as a site of new forms of digital labor. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Web3, I'm thinking about the kind of world of crypto and blockchain and NFTs and yeah, I mean, like those kind of crazy things that end up being the jargony terms of big tech and Silicon Valley. And we often kind of dismiss that as simply big tech broism gone off the rails. And in some ways, that's very much the case. But in terms of the promises of Web3, they very much have been taken up very seriously in places across the world, such as Southeast Asia, specifically in terms of the Philippines and Vietnam as leaders of adopting Web3 technologies and crypto. And I've been really interested in why that is. And I can talk about this more with maybe some of the other questions, but it has to do with the longer history of imperialism that has created the Philippines to be a kind of experimental site for the expansion of digital networks and the extractive kind of operations of digital capitalism. I've been really interested in crypto games that became really popular during the pandemic, such as this Pokemon-like-esque game called Axie Infinity that many Filipinx players played during the pandemic and made a lot of money, but then also lost a lot of money on. Maybe I will end there and pick up this conversation in the Q&A.
Hello, good afternoon. It's nice to see you all here. I was just telling Lisa, I said, we need to get the energy in the room up. You know what I'm saying? We're all here to get, yeah, woo! Thank you. Thank you, my homies in the back. But anyways, happy to be here with y'all. My name is Jasmine Banks. I am a rising fifth year. Y'all, I got to get a job. I'm a rising fifth year in Department of Psychology here at University of Michigan. And I also am really involved in the digital studies and communications departments here. And since I've been involved in organizing this panel, I've been like, dang, I don't really know, because they're talking about some serious things, are like in a very different way than what I've been thinking about was infrastructure. And I've been really marinating on this, especially since we last met, about how I fit into this work, how my work contributes to this conversation. And something that is really central to me being in this research area was I started grad school in 2020, which in itself was a whole thing. But coming in, I did very different work. I worked with marginalized communities. I worked with women who have experienced homelessness, a lot of social justice oriented work. And coming into our program, that there wasn't the same opportunities for me to do the work I wanted to do. So I had to pivot a bit. And that's when I first got involved in the research around Black digital experiences. And at the time, I was working on a project with my advisor looking at experiences of online racial discrimination by Black youth and Black undergrads here. And during the process of me doing this work, I started to notice a lot of the literature in psychology and a lot of the social sciences, they were focusing on Black digital use, Black technology, the relationships between Blackness and technology in a very deficit way. And the focus being around discrimination, harassment, trauma, experiencing trauma, vicarious, all types of trauma. And while those lines are all really valid and really important, I started to recognize that while all of these things are happening, there's still something that's sustaining people's interest in these spaces. And I started to draw a lot on my experiences, both as a content creator and a chronically online, a millennial, Gen Z, I don't know, we ain't talking about that, but somewhere in that age bracket of being really online and seeing like, yeah, all these things are happening, but for how I understood, like how I saw those and how a lot of the conversations in the spaces that I'm in with other users is that those things are like in the backdrop, they're happening, but there's so many other interesting things happening where we're creating these spaces for ourselves online. And that's really when I first got interested in meaning making, and I wanted to understand how our users, particularly Black users, making sense in the digital space around identity, thinking about how do we understand something in the digital as Black? What are the things I wanted to understand, the cues, what are we looking for? How do we know we're in this space? Which led me to a theme that I've been grappling with and probably will for the rest of my career, of this idea of, in the sense of these coded language, and in every discipline, there's a different way to get at this idea of an ethos of familiarity, of being in a place where you know, oh, I get what they're talking about. These are my people, even when there's nothing explicit. And I started building on this idea and thinking about, in terms of infrastructure, thinking about the ways that we're creating these internal worlds. And again, in different disciplines, it's life worlds, Black interiority, and other ways that we're thinking about how we're creating our own space. And in a class that I took in my first or second year with Dr. Oliver Hampson here, in that class, we did this activity of ecosystem mapping and social media mapping, where we all engage in how we, like, visualizing how we see our social networks and the ways that we categorize them, because not everybody uses LinkedIn in the same way. Like, people will be wilding on there in ways that I would never, and vice versa on Twitter and all these other platforms. And people are creating different worlds within the digital world and bringing in the psychology of it all. I'm interested in like how we are engaging with these worlds, how we're making sense in these spaces. And I think a lot about the mundane. And I had a presentation a few months ago where I shared one of the themes of my study of a core characteristic of Black digital culture that I found through studies with focus groups with Black users is the mundane is really important. And it's important for ways that aren't really understood. And somebody raised their hand and was like, I think that the word that you're using, mundane, doesn't work. I think you maybe think of another word because it gives off this vibe and it makes it seem like it's not serious. It's not this, that, and the other, which like really just showed me. And I responded, well, first of all, you did not listen to me at all, because the entire reason why I'm choosing to use the word mundane is because the way that these are the language that users are using. When I ask Black users, what are the important things? What's sustaining it? What do you like about it? What's happening? And they said, it's the mundane things. It's the everyday things. It's rarely the things that's like Black Lives Matter. It's rarely a thing that people bring up as, oh yeah, this is like what's happening. That's just like a byproduct. But the things that's really important in these spaces are like how we're making meaning in the everyday. And I'll get into this a bit more, but I also just want to shout out to all the advisors and mentors that I have that aren't in the room, that are in the room, for all the times that you really listen to me yap, but really help me think through these ideas that I have a lot of trouble trying to synthesize from psychology and reading geography, which is different, and reading sociology and humanities, and all these ways that I'm trying to get at the idea of Black digital world building and getting to this idea of how we're creating these internal worlds. So I appreciate you all.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to address the first question to the group, and it's a long one, but it basically asks everybody to reflect a little bit on how the structure, history, or technological features or affordances of the internet networks or platforms that you study reflect the kinds of relationships between power, empire, and colony, or whatever you want to put in there, power, tech experimentation, non-white users, and how you have found that people have challenged these relations. So I'm not asking you to say there's resistance and it's great. It's more the question of what are maybe the frictions, right? What are the things that are intervening in the otherwise smooth operations of this kind of biopolitical capital that builds these things?
This country is built on stolen Indian land. We know that. And we know who worked the land. We know that. And yet that is always ignored and obfuscated in the news, in discussions of infrastructure, in discussions of housing, always, to the point that we begin to think that is the reality. That happened in the past and that's over. And the people of that time are gone. We're a new kind of people. We are American Indians. We are African Americans, a new kind of people. Okay, except no, it's still stolen Indian land. And we still see a lot of unpaid, underpaid labor and exploitation and stigma, social stigma, if you're a member of one of these social groups or even proximate to them. You know, even if you're friends with us, you're stigmatized. If you listen to us and trust us and work with us, you're stigmatized, right? Okay, in information, so I started out as a librarian because I believe in the power of stories. I know, library, that's the only job I've done where I felt I was just doing every day something good for my neighbor. And now as a professor, I wonder. So anyway, but yeah, I started out as a librarian because I believe in the power of stories very deeply, because that is how I learned growing up, was through stories. And I don't mean like Anne Rice and stuff. Yeah, that was fun. But the stories that I heard from my grandparents, from my mom and dad, I can't remember. Oh, I think you were talking about how your family you have a gift of making white folks laugh or something. My dad's extremely charming. He's so funny. He can make the darkest things so funny. But he's from the border. And he's got this kind of logic, this way of thinking that's very much informed by the trauma of the Mexican Revolution. It's very much informed by growing up working in fields, picking onions in the hot sun in Phoenix, Arizona, picking cantaloupe melons. Those are so sweet and refreshing. Yeah, not if you're picking them, you know. Anyways, but then I became a librarian. I was working in Fresno, and I realized that those books are still not written about us, by us, for us. The stories are not there. I was a children's librarian. I was trying to order books for the World Languages collection, and they're not there. And if you've ever been to Fresno, I used to think that El Paso, Texas was the armpit of the United States. Then I went to Fresno. No disrespect, okay? I just told you where I'm from, okay? I'm not making myself any better than the Sovaco. But anyway, yeah, I realized these are exactly the people who need the stories. And why aren't they? So I started thinking about infrastructure already. Publishing infrastructures, national bibliograph, structures bibliography, how do we provide access? And Ngozi, you were talking about those systems, the information networks. Those are very intentionally designed. Went and got a doctorate degree. And I needed a way to convey to my fellow information science colleagues. So information science is a politically centrist sort of field, which is wrapped up in the motivations and goals of an earlier conservative period, the Cold War, right? It has a conquer mission to it. It's very much about national security and so forth. But nobody's going to say that, right? Because they don't study history. But anyways, so I needed a way to convey to them a couple of things. One, I'm not going to be somebody who studies indigenous technologies, because then I become like, I run the risk of becoming an anthropologist in the settler tradition. So I don't want to go up to people and be like, yeah, I study indigenous technologies. Oh, maize, the pyramids of Tenochtitlan, those people back then no longer exist. How would they design computation now? That's too risky, right? Because then that fixes my people as dead and gone. And we are already communities that suffer a great deal of unnatural death. I said, let me look at infrastructure, because communications infrastructure is important for statecraft. It's important for the imperial project. And let me give you examples of how tribes are doing this, with or without you. So I found at the time a couple of examples of tribes who had effectively leveraged their sovereignty. So for those who are not very conversant in this area, we have close to 600 tribes in the United States. They have, I think it's 500 and I can't remember, maybe 587 are federally recognized. So they have a nation-to-nation relationship. They are not part of the states. Really, we should think of the United States as a confederation of states and tribes. It should be the United States and tribes of America. That's really what it is. But that's not in the popular imagination. It's not taught in civics. So what we have in that situation is tribes who are using their governance power. Self-governance is different from self-determination, another important distinction. They're using that governance power to build up the essential infrastructure, what we think is public infrastructure, like in Tennessee or Virginia or Arizona. Actually, if you study maps, network maps, it intentionally bypasses areas where there's large reservations. Why? The reservation system was designed as a means to hold natural resources in case the United States ran out in its time of construction, right? In its time of westward expansion. That's what reservations are. Okay, and if a reservation has a fort on it, it was a prison where they kept Indians. And so the Indian represents the most unassimilated, person not capable of assimilation. That's why we have the boarding schools where so many people died, right? They didn't deserve to continue because they're not assimilatable, right? So I needed something to be able to show to my colleagues in information science and people who are doing design and engineering and so forth, especially the ones who are working with tribes. I see you. I see your work. You're not just a tool or working on some tech. You're not just a network admin. I see that you respect our knowledge, you respect our lands, and you respect our laws. And you're using that to construct something. So then we're not subhuman, because we all know how colonization works. There's at least 4 mechanisms, right? Okay, so the first one, reclassification of the existing population in support of the elite. And indigenous folks and black folks are usually at the bottom in the Americas, way at the bottom, right? And then the second thing is spatial redistribution. You strip out all the lands, all the places, all the locations, and you give them to the elite. And if it was a place where folks would gather who came from the lower classes, destroy it, right? The third mechanism is the development of institutions that support the elite. And that means that you're going to negate all the existing indigenous governments, the places of worship, the community gardens, whatever it was, you got to get rid of them. And then the fourth mechanism is redistribution of knowledge. And so that's the oppression of our indigenous ways of knowing, of all the languages, and the creation of a nationalist, centrist way of knowing. And if anybody deviates from that, it's, that's un-American, unpatriotic, okay? So I needed to show an infrastructure that defeats all of that, right? Okay, so if we look at reclassification of the population, okay, and we have a tribal group that's building up their own, we can say, look, we're not these subhuman people who don't know how to do innovation, obviously. Like in North Dakota, all y'all people are all disconnected around here till they built their own internet infrastructure. And you were going to the tribe for subscriptions. So we're not subhuman anymore. We're business partners. Pay the bill, that kind of thing. So I needed to do that. As far as the second mechanism, which is the spatial, the taking of the lands and so forth, I needed to show that if we can prove that we build this tower here and the network across, here's the proof where we're having conversation about land and spectrum, access to airwaves, taxation. So we're extending sovereignty, actually, and territoriality when tribes build out internet. Number 3, which is the creation of those institutions. Now we have Native people who are informing the build out of broadband and internet in this country. folks who are in charge of their own regulation and their own small enterprise and so forth, not to mention creative ventures. And then number 5, the languages. What do we do when we have our own online stuff, right? We teach our languages, we develop new technological discourses. And so this was a way that I could push back at a lot of the low-key, degrading principles that were happening in my field and honor the colleagues and folks in the field who are doing that important work. So I think I'll just move it on. Oh, I keep taking your.
Hi. So I'll start by saying, thinking with a colleague of mine, Erin McElroy's new book, Silicon Valley Imperialism, and thinking about how certain ideologies and certain concepts from Silicon Valley, certain infrastructures, reach out and reorganize space and create a network structure to maintain its influence, to govern populations. But in fact, Silicon Valley imperialism is just part of a longer tradition of US imperialism. And if we think about Silicon Valley imperialism, then if that is what we have today, what's the history of Silicon Valley imperialism? And for me, is thinking about the maquila as part of that history. Thinking about Intel and Fairchild going to Hong Kong and establishing operations there, that's part of Silicon Valley imperialism. And there's amazing, fantastic work that has been written already about the electronics industry in Indonesia. Iwan Ong's work. There's amazing work by sociologists, Latina sociologist Fernandez Kelly. There's amazing work already that tackles the electronics industry, broadly described. But I'm really interested in the matter of computing and the semiconductor itself as this kernel that can tell us a larger history in terms of the reorganization of land, the reorganization of relations, and the administration of peoples. Now, if I were to do that, you could easily fall into a kind of a trap whereby agency is just concentrated into the Silicon Valley operators, right? Where you have the Fairchild agents going and doing things over there, and then they bring things back, and that's it. That's the end of the story. But that's a trap I don't want to fall into. So it's a matter of thinking, how did Mexicans, in terms of the maquilas, how did Mexicans participate in this? In fact, one of the ways that they did was that they wanted to employ and deploy development strategies in the mid-20th century as a way to develop their economy, to expand its economy. And sure, you can go into the history of developmental regimes, and Arturo Escobar's work is right there, really influential for me. So that brings us then that kind of Mexican agency, but it's not the let's celebrate Mexican agency. It's also, what does that development regime in Mexico produce? What kind of relations does that make possible? How do people have to live with that? So then it's a matter of what's another agent I can think with in terms of living with this Silicon Valley imperialism. And that for me is thinking about the assembly line worker as part of that story. And that's also where it again gets messy, because I've been starting to interview workers, and for a lot of them, and this happened to Lisa as well, because I know about this part in her own project, for these workers, they really loved working in these factories. It really meant a lot for them because it signified a way for them to maintain their families, to provide for their families, to care for their families in a way that was sufficient for them not just to survive, but actually thrive. So I have to be cognizant of that dimension. And how do I make sense of that if I just keep thinking with this kind of extractivist, imperialist model of like, here comes the agents coming to extract and doing all the things, and then, well, we don't get an insight into how are people actually living with these infrastructures. So that's how I'm thinking about U.S. empire, thinking about imperialism in a kind of stacks, but also thinking about different communities. And one of the ways that I'm able to do that is I'm thinking of the maquila as that boundary object. And the way that I'm starting to theorize the maquila as an interface. It's a kind of programming element that could help bring in actors together, help bring in users together, but not providing the same kind of usages, not providing the same kind of benefits. Yeah, that's what I'll say.
So I think I answered part of this question already, so I'll be brief. The first thing I'll say is that not thinking about infrastructure is a symptom of a privileged position. It takes several hours to upload an image in Gaza. All Palestinian tech has to be routed through Israel. The same companies that are producing these technologies of connection are also producing weapons and biometrics. So not thinking about these things is a symptom, again, of a privileged position. So this is not something that Palestinians always have to be thinking about infrastructure, right? Especially when your infrastructure is being destroyed like clockwork every few years, right? And I also want to point to tech being at the center of the colonial narrative in Israel, right? Israel is established in the wake of Cold War era shit. And their big justification for taking away land from Palestinians was that they're not caring for it properly. They learned a lot from their American and Australian and Canadian friends. And the way that Israel continues to create this military tech industrial complex that has these deep linkages to Silicon Valley demonstrate the centrality of technological innovation and development. One of the big things that happened at the start of the Gaza genocide was that there was this worry that Israeli tech was going to see a downturn in purchases because we all saw the Iron Dome is a piece of shit, man. It can't do shit. But that's not the case, actually. These tech industries coming out of Israel are booming because now they get to say that they have been tested in action, that there's experience, that these have been proven to be working, and then they can send this tech out saying that this has been tested on people, right? And so I think in the context of Palestine, I think a lot of the conversations that we've been having here right now talk about how do we make tech better? How do we make tech serve for us? And I think in the context of Palestine, we need to think about a refusal to be included into these technological regimes. It's not about making this tech work for Palestinians. It's more about destruction of this technology, a refusal to be imbricated in these power systems. Because no matter how much we dress up AI, that shit's used to kill Gazans, right? And we can make it so it's more inclusive for the rest of us. But at the end of the day, this shit's all made for military use. And so I want to push back on thinking about how do we do design better, right? And maybe we just need to stop designing. Maybe we just need to, probably shouldn't say that if it's we're being live streamed. Maybe we just need to non-violently destroy some tech, right? I want to say blow some shit up, but yeah.
Very well said, yes. So yeah, I've been thinking about some of the previous comments about Silicon Valley imperialism and having to do sometimes the hard historical work of thinking about these longer histories of infrastructural networks, which I think for at least some of us, I think in a lot of ways all of us, is also a question of labor and the ways in which labor takes shape. And a lot of my, recent interest has been venturing into the field of game studies and trying to think about how digital capitalism and extractive forms of labor have taken up through the form of games. But also at the same time, I'm also wrestling with the question that Yvonne posed about not flattening these analyses or frameworks to just a narrative of extraction. And that's something that I don't think I have a full answer to in my work, since I think in some ways, if I were an ethnographer, I would just go talk to some of the users or some of the players. But I think this is perhaps just a methodological question that I am wrestling with. So much of my work is about critique and about tracing how these longer histories of extract came to be. I've been really interested in the Philippines, primarily because the Filipinos and the Philippines have been a site of, Filipinos have a long history of being really excellent gamers. So in some ways, it's not a surprise that Web3 and crypto gaming has come to the forefront in the Philippines. But I've been thinking a lot about the kind of histories in which this has happened, and I'm building off of scholars such as John Padios and Sarah Roberts' work, who have written about Filipino content moderation and call center work and the creation of what John Padios calls Filipino-American relatability, that there is this kind of cultural proximity to Americanness because of this longer imperial relation, but also a kind of geographic distance that makes the Philippines kind of an ideal site for experimentation. And in terms of Web3, which I fully have not made sense of, a lot of the reason why, these kind of really scammy forms of digital capitalism trafficking under the title of Web3 has found a home in the Philippines is because of its large remittance economy and the kind of decentralization of finance that has been the kind of the economy of the Philippines. And 40% of the country, I believe, 40% of the country is unbanked, but at the same time, there's a high percentage of Filipinos who have access to the internet. So casual gaming is a really big part of Filipino culture. And it's interesting to think about how all of these kind of conditions are in place for something like crypto gaming to take shape in the Philippines. And I really wish in retrospect, I regret not showing some of the photos of Axie Infinity, which I've written about. And it's really this strange kind of layering of various kind of Asian dimensions. Like it's drawing from this nostalgia of Japanese Pokemon collectibles to create this like NFT game that's produced in Vietnam and is primarily played on the global scale in the Philippines. So this triangulation of all of this history that's encapsulated in the game is something that I've been really interested in. But yeah, I guess I wanted to just maybe also underline this question about extraction, because I've been trying to write about this phenomenon, and that's primarily been my argument. But I don't know. This panel, I think, is pushing me to think.
Wow. You guys have really dropped some gems. I've been taking notes. And it reminded me a lot of our previous conversations, this conversation about power and infrastructure. And our conversations really pushed me to think about the things that I'm not thinking about, things I haven't considered in terms of even just the digital social media. And I recently was just at an ACM conference fact last week, which gave me a lot to think about. And the first thing that really started to give me another context to the power infrastructures are the invisible labor that goes into it, and thinking about crowdsourced workers and content moderation workers, and a lot of that being outsourced intentionally, and the workers that are engaged in this work are exposed daily to really horrific things that they aren't getting training for, they aren't getting any type of care for, they aren't getting paid well, and it's really cutthroat in a way that it doesn't have to be. And in this space where I was with a bunch of computer scientists, philosopher-esque type of people, I asked them in a panel of people from IBM, Google, all these people that were talking about wanting to do work with indigenous communities in Brazil and around the world and make all these better, great tech, blah, blah, blah. And they're talking about interviewing these communities as if it's a simple, easy, I'm just going to ask 3-4 questions. And I had posed a question I hear you all talk about doing this care work, because it is care work to ask people to share intimate details of their lives, or especially their trauma with you, so that you can build a better app for them. And are there people in the room that can actually ask those questions? Are you thinking about counselors or psychologists? Are you actually thinking about an ethics of care from the beginning before you even consider what the outcomes will be and what the goals are? I don't do research because research is cool. I do research because I care about the people. And that seems to be a piece that's really missing. And this also, in our conversations, brought up the idea of the infrastructures of disposability and thinking about the things that are getting in the way of power, whether that's the power to create infrastructure, the power to have money, the power of over ownership and agency of your own data and all this stuff. What's not really being considered in this is infrastructures of disability, meaning the people who are just thrown to the side, the people that do the grunt work, the people who they're taking from and trying to sell it back to them in a way that's so trippy. So to this question about power power infrastructure. And what we've talked about so far between the physical infrastructures, the imagined, virtual, or idealized infrastructures oftentimes leave out the people who are there right now and the people who already have some form of structure. And it's just a really like off balance thing to do to these communities, and thinking like, oh, we can come in and do better and do all these other different forms of like reform that you definitely need, because I'm telling you, you need.
Thank you, everybody. So we have a few more questions, and I'm just going to throw out two, and you can answer either one that you want. One of them picks up from where Jasmine was ending, which is this question about recentering humanity and the needs of humans in infrastructure. So when Meryem was talking about kind of a design abolitionism, like an argument against tuning or training or tweaking or otherwise optimizing something, which is fundamentally the same thing, a more radical move against the kind of settler infrastructure sensibility. I might ask you to talk about, like, where is the human in the way you work, right? It could be method, it could be the way you think about what infrastructure is. Does it include humans? And also, what do you see as some of the lines of connection between what you all do? Because to me, even though these are very geographically dispersed, there is a kind of thematic that's becoming more apparent to me. So anybody is free to start with that.
I wanted to just encourage you to follow No Tech for Apartheid and No Tech for Genocide on Instagram. No Tech for Genocide in particular is very active right now, and they're providing a lot of the information so that you can learn more about how these major tech platforms, companies, and workers are sort of, their skill sets are being channeled to something very devastating, atrocious genocidal acts. So I just want to, they have meetings and trainings and things like that. So there's that. As far as recentering the human, this is the fundamental question, in particular for this audience, because as I mentioned before, for a long time, Indigenous peoples of the Americas are not viewed as human. We're not viewed as human beings. We're subhuman until well into modernity. To some extent, that's still happening because these American Indians are still viewed as sources of appropriation, as are Indigenous peoples around the world. Once again, returning to our theme of Israel's technical power and who it tests on, we know that it tests at the border, this connection with Yvonne's work. Our border wall is constructed through Elbit Industries, and that's built on Indian land, Tana Atam land, Yaqui land, Apache land, and it's used to surveil. It's this very sophisticated surveillance assemblage at the border, surveils everybody coming across, but in particular, it supports these regimes of undocumentation of people who are indigenous, from the people, Mayan workers who are coming across, seasonal labor, folks just trying to get to their home in Nogales or wherever. So if we think of restoring humanity, yes, it's with regard to what we know of human rights, right? The human rights and civil rights in different countries. What are those rights which we've agreed on internationally or locally? If you study human rights, you know there's failures. The same thing with civil rights is different in every country, right? In every context, in every state, some are upheld, some are not. So we know those are constantly contested terrains. Indigenous rights are an interesting space to understand where the human is, because we don't think of the human necessarily as the individual, the hyper-individualistic figure, which is like the Western ideal. Like the human, is this chair human? No, because it's not alive. Like Marisa's human, chair not human, computer not human, this not human, me human, right? There's these like strict boundaries. But that's really challenged in a lot of indigenous languages and for a lot of indigenous peoples around the world, because we believe in kin. What makes you human is your relationships, is the kin. So for those of you who are post-structuralist network folks, you understand that what gives a person discourse, what creates the group, is all that tissue that's between us, that what happens in those interactions. It's the communication. And we map it out in these, but even those network maps are really flattened because they don't show the richness of what that is or how it's occurring. So going back to human information behavior, how do we take in information, right? It's sensory, it's part of our memories. It's not just, you're not a machine who's just like downloading. There's also this meaning making that occurs. It's this very rich textural process. And I really like borrowing from a lot of Mexican sociologists, the idea of tejido social. Tejido, because the word tejido in English, it's textile. But when we think of textile, we don't, as Americans, we're industrialized. We don't think of the act of the weavers. collecting, making, creating the designs and so forth. I like tejido social because it's this social weaving, the social tapestry that we're a part of. So if you think of the human in that way, that's a way I can mediate to get to these other, I guess you could call them the non-human relations that make infrastructures actually also deeply human. So I'll stop there.
For me, it's through method in part. One of the things that I feel occurred to me when I was working on my first book project, initially when it was a dissertation, it was very structural, very system-oriented, and the human was there, but it was also hard to see. And in part, it's because I'm so influenced by its scholarship that blurs the boundary of the human, and the human is all these different entanglements and relations. So in trying to navigate that while still holding on to these understandings, one thing for me is to think about the work needed for something to function, the work that occurs so that someone feels care, the care that is, or the work that is needed so that an assembly line actually operates, the work that is needed in all these different iterations. So by looking at the work, you have to look at all these human agents and human actors, but also the human and their relations, the human subject and their relations. And that's how I grapple with that. I also want to throw, no, it's not really a wrench actually, but thinking about connections across our work, one thing that I've noticed significantly is this notion of experimentality as a mode of governance. And that is, I feel like, it's quite present in everybody's work. But it's thinking about experimentality as central in the making, in the maintenance, and in the operation of information infrastructures, that it could be quite, we could pay attention to the representation in terms of the screens and in terms of the interactions that unfold on the screens. But behind the screens, the material that makes the screen, right? Thinking about even critical minerals, thinking about all these different facets, that is also part of the representation, of the rhetoric or the discourse. So that is another way of thinking about not just the humanity, but also thinking about all. I'm not in love with the notion of scale, but thinking across scales, thinking about stacks, thinking across networks, not sure. Yeah.
I wanted to ask if we're going to do Q&A, because what do y'all think?
Yeah, let's do some Q&A. I mean, everybody is on such a roll. I'd love to hear some questions. Yeah, go ahead.
So this has been really great, and I think there are a lot of really, I guess I'm just going to point out some things that I'm noticing across the three panels we've heard so far for today, and to open up maybe a larger conversation about failure, which I feel that Stephanie brought up, but I think specifically failure in relation to innovation regarding the first panel of the day. I come from like a media archaeology heavy background, I would say. And media archaeology, which is historically a very white European, it's like Northern European actually, field, which is related to infrastructure studies, but I would say maybe they're not the same. But with media archaeology, there's this emphasis on resisting smooth narratives of innovation, of invention, of development, and instead focusing on moments of breakdown, failure, technologies that have been forgotten because they weren't successful commercially. And so I feel like all of that is here, but I feel like what's going on seems much more complex and doesn't necessarily just fit into this idea of, I think, something we also hear in infrastructure studies, right? Good infrastructure is something that you don't notice. You notice it when it breaks down, and therefore failure or breakdown can be a way of becoming aware of the infrastructures that are often invisible. But as Meryem was pointing out, to not notice infrastructure implies a certain privileged position. I just feel like there are some interesting conversations around what it might mean to lean into that failure or not rushing to try to fix something. But I don't know that I necessarily have it fully articulated as to what that would mean. But I guess I'm just wondering if, since I think most of you are familiar with the kind of discourses I'm referring to, like within media archaeology, within infrastructure studies, whether you think that kind of framing of innovation versus failure is useful or if it's limiting. It seems like some of the conversations here that are arising are actually like somewhat methodological. Like as Huan, you were saying, how do you avoid this kind of, in a way, top-down just ideology critique that doesn't attend to individual experiences, but how do you do that without doing ethnography? And I think one book that, I bring it up all the time because I think about it a lot, is Tung Wei Hu's Digital Lethargy. And I feel like that is a book where it's like thinking about how a feeling is experienced unevenly and that how that has race and class implications, but also the idea that lethargy doesn't necessarily have to be bad or negative. And the way he also writes about, people doing certain kinds of micro work might experience that as pleasurable and that it can be patronizing to just frame this in terms of kind of exploitation. So I don't know, there's just a string of thoughts, but I think just maybe if people want to speak to these terms I'm flagging, innovation, failure. I'm going to take the next question as well so that you can,
Hey, great panel. And this probably is more of an unprocessed thought, but also a question in it. But I guess for me, when I was thinking about you talking about optimism, and maybe for me it's because I always think about like the definition of the word, how you're talking about it means hopefulness and confidence about the future of successful outcomes, or thinking about how that exists in connection to friction, and how when I hear Kamil talk about disillusionment with optimism, and then thinking about Professor Duarte's discussion about America or the United States. One of the challenges is when you think about America and sovereignty, you are talking about everything that makes America exceptional in its ideal is because of genocide, is because of murder, is because of rape, depending on which group you're in, that has affected you in so many different ways. And so when you're talking about land acknowledgement or just land, I'm often wondering which power speaks to who's going to give the land back, or who's going to not try to smooth out the friction, because in some ways, and I'm not saying people are saying that, in some ways some things will not be able to be smoothed out. And then when you're thinking about your work, how would you, more to the person next to me, I can't remember your name, my apologies, is when you think about your methods, and I'm working on my dissertation proposal, how do you fuse that together? Because you're really fusing together a lot of ideologies that do not coexist in a wonderful way at all, because decolonization is violent. Who will be dismantling the system in itself, and do we need to burn it down and create something different? Or when you think about technology and how infrastructurally you're thinking about, well, what works good? Because when you say that, I think about the organizations you mentioned that might use their power for good or for useful ways, but you're still using it within the system that when we say inclusivity, we may not mean your group. At least this week we might not. So thank you.
So I want to push back on the idea that failure is subversive within the context of Palestine. So one of the objects that I look at is in 2016. All of my objects are from 2016. I think that's the last time I did any work. So in 2016, there were a group of Israeli soldiers who were using the phone app Waze to navigate the West Bank. And they put in Qalandia. Now, Qalandia is the name of a checkpoint, a crossing, but it's also the name of a refugee camp that was established in 1948. And also, just side note, there are refugee camps that have been established in 1948 that still exist in Palestine. It's just, I think, something that we don't think about how mind-blowing that is. Yeah, so they put in the wrong Qalandia. They accidentally went through a Palestinian town, and the Palestinians were like, what the fuck are you doing here? And started throwing stones and stuff at them. And they killed a young student named Iyad Omar Sajadiya. So that's a failure of technology. But it was a success for Israel because their goal is to kill Palestinians. And so is the answer to that situation, oh, maybe Waze should have better maps? Maybe we should contribute more data to ways so people don't accidentally get killed. So then people can get purposefully killed instead, right? And so I want to think about within the context of especially what I was referring to with Israeli tech in general is we see the deep failure of their defense and offensive tech. But that doesn't mean that less Palestinians are dying. So just, I'm the wet blanket of the conference. I didn't get the memo about optimism, literally. But yeah, no, I just wanted to push back on like this idea of all failure is subversive, because when it comes to a settler colonial structure, anything can be taken advantage of, right? You can use success and failure to kill indigenous people.
You won't be alone. I'll join you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm also. I've used failure. I think it has some generative elements to it. I'm also very much influenced by media archaeology myself. But one of the limitations is that oftentimes failure doesn't account for damage, and I think it's important to think about damage. And that brings to light all other kinds of relations and other kinds of processes. And in your case, thinking about damage would get us away from this kind of optimization, would get us to grapple with the different kinds of violence that are unfolding and the infrastructures necessary for them.